My name is Jessica Martinez, and I've been obsessed with flying since I was 7 years old. Growing up in a small Texas town, I spent countless hours at my grandfather's crop dusting operation, watching those yellow biplanes dance across the sky like mechanical butterflies. While other kids played with dolls, I was rebuilding carburetors and learning about lift coefficients. By 25, I'd saved every penny from my job as an aircraft mechanic to attend Thunderbird Aviation Academy, one of the most prestigious civilian flight schools in the country. Their alumni went on to major airlines, military contracts, and aerospace careers that most pilots only dreamed about. The acceptance letter felt like winning the lottery. I arrived on campus in September with my beat-up Honda Civic packed with everything I owned. The facilities were incredible. Gleaming hangars, state-of-the-art simulators, and a fleet of training aircraft that made my heart race. But what impressed me most was meeting Captain Derek Morrison, the chief flight instructor. Morrison was a legend, former Air Force, with over 10,000 flight hours and a reputation for producing exceptional pilots. He was also the kind of man who commanded respect just by walking into a room. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to calculate wind speed and trajectory in casual conversation. "Welcome to Thunderbird," he said during orientation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "Some of you think flying is about freedom. Let me be clear, it's about discipline, precision, and following protocols exactly as written. Those who can't adapt won't make it past month 1. I felt ready for that discipline. I'd been preparing my whole life. The first red flag appeared during ground school. While reviewing our class roster, Morrison paused at my name with a slight frown. "Martinez, you're the mechanic, right? From that crop dusting outfit in Brownsville?" "Yes, sir. My grandfather's operation." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Interesting. Well, we'll see how that translates to real aviation." There was something in his tone, not quite dismissive, but definitely skeptical. Like he'd already categorized me as someone who didn't quite belong. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was 2024, not 1950. Surely a place as prestigious as Thunderbird wouldn't discriminate based on background or gender. I had the credentials, the passion, and the skill. What could possibly go wrong? Cracks in the formation the first month at Thunderbird should have been challenging but fair. Instead, it became clear that Morrison had already decided who the real pilots were, and I wasn't one of them. It started subtly. During pre-flight briefings, he'd call on me for the most obscure regulations, questions he never asked the other students. When I answered correctly, which I always did, he'd nod curtly and move on without acknowledgement. When I struggled with something, however, he'd pause the entire class to elaborate on my mistake. "Miss Martinez seems to think you can fly a Cessna like a crop duster," he announced one morning after I'd made a slightly aggressive turn during pattern work. "Perhaps she needs a reminder that precision aviation requires finesse, not farmyard techniques." The snickers from my classmates stung, but I kept my mouth shut. I was there to learn, not to prove a point. The real problem started during practical exercises. Morrison assigned flight partners for instrument training, and somehow I always ended up with the weakest students. Guys who clearly weren't pulling their weight, but never seemed to face the same scrutiny I did. When Tommy Richardson nearly caused a runway incursion during a practice approach, Morrison's feedback was gentle. "Just needs more confidence, Tommy. You'll get there." When I executed a flawless short field landing the same day, saving us from Tommy's overcorrection, Morrison's only comment was, "Adequate, Martinez. Try to stick to standard procedures next time." The breaking point of that first month came during emergency procedures training. We were practicing engine failures in the simulator when Morrison threw a curveball scenario at me, a double engine failure with hydraulic problems. Something way beyond the standard curriculum. I worked through it methodically, managing the emergency exactly as I'd been taught. But the simulator's programming seemed to fight every input. Warning lights kept flashing despite my correct responses, and the virtual aircraft handled like it was fighting against my commands. Time, Morrison called after 10 minutes of struggle. That's exactly the kind of panic response that gets people killed, Martinez. You're overthinking everything instead of trusting your training. I wanted to argue that the simulator seemed to be malfunctioning, but Tommy Richardson went next with a simpler scenario. Single engine failure, standard procedures, and sailed through it with Morrison's encouragement. That night, I called my grandfather. Maybe I'm not cut out for this, I admitted, sitting alone in my dorm room while my classmates socialized in the common area. Jess, he said in his weathered voice, I've watched you handle aircraft since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You've got more natural skill than anyone I've ever seen. Don't let some fancy instructor make you doubt what you know in your bones. His words steadied me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison was testing me differently than everyone else. And I was starting to suspect those tests weren't designed for me to pass. The pressure mounts by October. Morrison's treatment had escalated from subtle bias to outright hostility. What worried me more was how it was affecting the other students' perception of me. During formation flying exercises, Morrison would position me in the most challenging slots. Tight formation work that required split-second timing and absolute trust in your wingman. But instead of pairing me with experienced students, he'd assigned me with guys who were clearly struggling with basic concepts. Martinez, your lead today, he announced during one particularly windy morning. Richardson and Peterson, you're on her wings. Let's see if our crop duster can keep formation in real weather. The assignment was a setup. Richardson had been struggling with formation work for weeks, and Peterson was notorious for overcompensating on controls. Leading them in gusty crosswinds was like trying to herd cats, but somehow I managed to keep us together through the entire exercise. Morrison's debrief was brutal. Sloppy communication, Martinez. Your wingmen were all over the sky because you weren't providing clear leadership. In real aviation, that kind of performance would get people killed. I bit back my response. Richardson and Peterson had been fighting their aircraft the entire time. But apparently that was my fault for not leading them better. The isolation was getting worse too. During breaks, conversations would die when I approached. I'd catch students whispering and glancing in my direction. Morrison's constant criticism was poisoning the well, making everyone think I was the weak link in the program. Then Maria Santos joined our class as a transfer student from another flight school. She was sharp, confident, and immediately caught Morrison's attention, but not in the way I had. Welcome to Thunderbird, Miss Santos, Morrison said warmly during her introduction. I've reviewed your records from Phoenix Flight Academy. Impressive work. Maria was good, really good. But what struck me was how differently Morrison treated her. When she made mistakes, there were learning opportunities. When she excelled, she received genuine praise and encouragement. It was like watching a masterclass in how an instructor should actually behave. What's his deal with you? Maria asked quietly after our third week together. We were reviewing weather patterns in the study lounge, and I just endured another round of Morrison's pointed criticism during meteorology class. I honestly don't know, I replied. Maybe he thinks I don't belong here. Maria studied me for a moment. You know what I think. I think you're too good, and it threatens him. I've been watching your flying. You're better than half the guys in this program, but he treats you like you're barely competent. Her words meant more than she knew. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone, but Morrison wasn't done with me yet. That Friday, he announced a surprise evaluation, a cross-country navigation flight that would count toward our final grades. Each student would plan and execute a solo flight to 3 different airports, demonstrating everything we'd learned about navigation, weather analysis, and decision-making. Martinez, he said, looking directly at me with that familiar cold expression. You'll be flying to Midland, El Paso, and back to base. Weather's looking challenging, so I hope your unconventional training has prepared you for real aviation. I studied the weather reports that night. A low-pressure system was moving through West Texas. bringing scattered thunderstorms and variable winds. Challenging, but manageable for a competent pilot. What I didn't know was that Morrison had already decided this would be my last flight at Thunderbird Academy. The setup the morning of my evaluation flight. I arrived at the hangar before dawn to complete my pre-flight inspection. The Cessna 172 assigned to me was N739TB, an older aircraft but well-maintained. I checked every system twice, reviewed my flight plan, and confirmed weather conditions were within acceptable limits for the cross-country. Morrison appeared just as I was finishing my inspection. "Ready for your big day, Martinez?" "Yes, sir. Weather's looking good for the route, and the aircraft's in excellent condition." He made a show of checking my flight plan, his pen tapping against the clipboard. "Ambitious route for someone with your background. Sure you can handle the workload." The comment stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm confident in my preparation, sir. We'll see." He signed off on my paperwork with a flourish. "Remember, this evaluation counts for 30% of your final grade. No room for error." The first leg to Midland went perfectly. The morning air was smooth, navigation was spot on, and I executed a flawless landing despite a tricky crosswind. I was feeling confident as I refueled and planned the second leg to El Paso. That's when things started going wrong. Halfway to El Paso, the engine began running rough. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle change in the sound that made my mechanic's instincts prickle. I checked all the gauges. Oil pressure normal, temperature normal, RPM steady. But something was definitely off. Then the radio started acting up. I could hear air traffic control, but my transmissions seemed to be cutting out. I tried switching frequencies, checking connections, but the problem persisted. By the time I reached El Paso airspace, I was dealing with an engine that was definitely losing power and a radio that worked intermittently. I managed to get clearance to land, but it took 3 attempts to establish clear communication with the tower. The landing was rough, not dangerous, but far from my usual standards. The engine coughed and stumbled during the approach, and I had to ride the power to maintain a stable descent. During my ground inspection at El Paso, I found the problem: loose spark plug wires. It was the kind of maintenance issue that could cause exactly the problems I'd experienced. But here's the thing about loose spark plug wires: they don't just happen randomly. Someone had to physically loosen them. I tightened everything down and tested the engine. It ran smoothly again, but my confidence was shaken. Had this been sabotage or just unfortunate timing? The flight back to Thunderbird was uneventful until I was 10 miles from the airport. That's when Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "N739TB, be advised you're running 20 minutes behind schedule. Your performance today has been concerning. Copy, instructor. I experienced some minor mechanical issues that I corrected at El Paso." Mechanical issues, Martinez? Or pilot error? We'll discuss this during your debrief. I landed at Thunderbird as the sun was setting, my nerves frayed from managing aircraft problems all day. Morrison was waiting on the ramp with a clipboard and his usual stern expression. That was possibly the most unprofessional cross-country flight I had ever observed. He began before I'd even shut down the engine. Late arrivals, poor radio communication, unstable approaches. Exactly what I expected from someone who learned to fly in a crop field. "Sir, I documented mechanical issues with the aircraft." "There were no mechanical issues, Martinez. I personally inspected that aircraft this morning." His voice was cold vinyl. "What you experienced was pilot-induced problems caused by poor technique and inadequate preparation." I stared at him, understanding flooding through me like ice water. He was lying. He had to know about the loose spark plug wires. Any competent mechanic would have spotted them during inspection. But he was going to blame me for aircraft problems that were clearly maintenance-related. "I want a formal written report on my desk by 800 tomorrow," Morrison continued. "And I'll be recommending to the review board that you be dismissed from the program. Thunderbird Academy has standards, and you clearly don't meet them. That night, I sat in my dorm room staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to figure out how to write a report that might save my aviation career. But deep down, I knew Morrison had already made his decision. The sabotage aircraft was just his excuse to do what he'd wanted to do since day one. I was going to be washed out, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The gathering storm, the review board meeting, was scheduled for the following Friday. I spent the week in a haze, going through the motions of classes while knowing my fate was already sealed. Morrison barely acknowledged my presence, and my classmates treated me like I was already gone. But Maria Santos wasn't giving up on me. "This is bullshit, Jess," she said over coffee Wednesday night. "I've flown that same aircraft twice this semester, and I've noticed the radio cutting out both times. Morrison knows there are maintenance issues with that plane." "It doesn't matter what he knows," I replied numbly. "It's his word against mine, and he's the chief instructor." "Maybe not." Maria leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been asking around, talking to students from previous classes. You're not the first person Morrison has targeted." She pulled out her laptop and showed me a file she'd been secretly compiling. 3 other students over the past 2 years, all women, all from non-traditional aviation backgrounds, had been washed out under suspicious circumstances. "Look at this pattern," Maria said, scrolling through her notes. "Jennifer Walsh, former Air Force mechanic, dismissed for unsafe flying practices after her aircraft experienced multiple malfunctions during evaluation flights. Amanda Foster, aerospace engineering graduate, failed out after Morrison claimed she couldn't handle the physical demands of professional aviation. Rachel Kumar, commercial pilot with 500 hours, dismissed for poor judgment after a cross-country flight where her aircraft's GPS mysteriously failed. The pattern was undeniable, but I felt helpless to fight it. What am I supposed to do? Accuse Morrison of discrimination? He'll just say I'm making excuses for poor performance. Actually, Maria said with a sly smile, I might have something better than accusations. She explained that she'd been discreetly recording Morrison's interactions with students using her phone during class sessions. Most of it was innocent, but she'd captured several instances of him making subtly discriminatory comments. Remarks about women in aviation, jokes about non-traditional pilots, and most damning, a conversation where he told another instructor that some students just don't have the right attitude for professional aviation. It's not smoking gun evidence, Maria admitted, but it establishes a pattern of bias. Combined with the maintenance records I've been tracking, it might be enough to get someone's attention. I looked at her research, feeling the spark of hope for the first time in days. Why are you doing this for me? Because you're the best pilot in our class, and Morrison is trying to destroy you for all the wrong reasons. Also, she grinned, because I hate bullies. That night, I called my grandfather again. I might have a way to fight back, I told him, explaining Maria's evidence. Good, he said firmly. Your grandmother didn't raise me to back down from fights, and I didn't raise you to give up either. But remember, Jess, sometimes the best revenge is just proving them wrong. His words stuck with me as I prepared for the review board. I wasn't just fighting for my place at Thunderbird anymore. I was fighting for every woman who'd been told she didn't belong in a cockpit. The morning of the review board, I woke up with crystal clear purpose. Morrison might have rigged the game, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I dressed in my best suit, gathered Maria's evidence, and prepared to face the men who held my aviation future in their hands. Whatever happened, I was going to make sure they heard the truth about Derek Morrison and his systematic campaign to keep women out of his skies. But as I walked toward the administration building, I had no idea that my real vindication would come not from a committee room, but from 30,000 feet above the very runway where Morrison had tried to ground my dreams forever. The hearing the review board consisted of 3 men. Morrison himself, Academy Director Colonel James Mitchell, retired Air Force, and Senior Instructor Captain Robert Hayes. I sat across from them in the sterile conference room, my folder of evidence feeling pathetically thin against their combined authority. Morrison presented his case first, reading from his evaluation report in a monotone voice that made my performance sound like a disaster movie. According to him, I had demonstrated consistent poor judgment, inadequate aircraft control, and a concerning inability to handle standard aviation procedures. The cross-country evaluation was particularly troubling, he continued. Multiple navigation errors, poor radio communication, and unstable approaches at both destination airports. Miss Martinez clearly lacks the fundamental skills required for professional aviation. Colonel Mitchell nodded gravely. These are serious concerns, Captain Morrison. Miss Martinez, would you like to respond? I stood up, my heart hammering. Yes, sir. I believe there are significant inaccuracies in Captain Morrison's report. I presented Maria's evidence methodically. The maintenance records showing repeated issues with aircraft N739TB, audio recordings of Morrison's discriminatory comments, and the pattern of female students being dismissed under questionable circumstances. Are you suggesting, Captain Hayes interrupted, that Captain Morrison deliberately sabotaged your aircraft? I'm suggesting that the maintenance issues I experienced were real and documented, but Captain Morrison chose to ignore them in his evaluation. I'm also suggesting that there's a clear pattern of bias in how female students are treated and evaluated at this academy. Morrison's face had turned red during my presentation. This is exactly the kind of excuse-making and blame-shifting that proves my point about Miss Martinez's character. She cannot accept responsibility for her own failures. Colonel Mitchell studied the evidence for several long minutes. Finally, he looked up. Miss Martinez, these are serious allegations. However, Captain Morrison has been with this academy for 8 years and has an exemplary record. Without more concrete evidence of wrongdoing, we cannot overturn his professional evaluation. My heart sank, but I wasn't finished. Sir, I request permission to demonstrate my flying ability with an independent evaluation flight. The three men exchanged glances. That's unusual, Colonel Mitchell said slowly. Sir, if I truly lack the skills Captain Morrison claims, it should be obvious to any qualified instructor. I'm asking for one fair evaluation with an aircraft I can personally inspect beforehand. Morrison leaned forward. Colonel, this is highly irregular. Miss Martinez is simply trying to delay the inevitable. I'll do it. The voice came from the doorway. We all turned to see Captain Elena Rodriguez, a senior instructor I'd barely interacted with during my time at Thunderbird. She was a former Navy pilot with an impeccable reputation. I'll conduct an independent evaluation, she continued, entering the room. I've been following this case, and frankly, I have some concerns about the process. Give me 2 hours with Miss Martinez, and I'll provide you with an objective assessment of her abilities. Colonel Mitchell looked uncomfortable with the deviation from protocol, but he couldn't refuse such a reasonable request. Very well. Captain Rodriguez, you'll conduct a comprehensive evaluation covering all flight phases. Your assessment will be final. As we filed out of the conference room, Morrison caught my arm. You're only delaying the inevitable, Martinez. Some people just don't belong in the sky. I looked him straight in the eye. We'll see about that, sir. The flight of truth 2 hours later, I stood on the flight line with Captain Rodriguez, conducting the most thorough pre-flight inspection of my life. Unlike Morrison, she watched my technique with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions about my thought process. Your inspection is very methodical, she observed. Where did you learn to be so thorough with aircraft systems? My grandfather's crop dusting operation, ma'am. He taught me that aircraft maintenance isn't just about safety, it's about understanding your machine completely. She nodded approvingly. That's old-school aviation wisdom. Let's see how it translates to flight performance. The evaluation flight was unlike anything I'd experienced at Thunderbird. Captain Rodriguez was challenging but fair, pushing me through complex scenarios while providing clear feedback on my performance. We practiced emergency procedures, instrument approaches, and precision maneuvers. Take us to the practice area, she instructed after we completed the standard exercises. I want to see some advanced maneuvering. For the next 30 minutes, I flew like my life depended on it. Steep turns, short field landings, engine-out procedures. Everything I'd learned from years of practical experience combined with months of formal training. Captain Rodriguez said little during the flight, but I could feel her assessment in every instruction. As we returned to the airport, she finally spoke. Miss Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Do you believe you have the skills to be a professional pilot? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. So do I. We landed smoothly and Captain Rodriguez made notes on her evaluation form as we taxied back to the hangar. When we shut down, she turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. That was some of the finest flying I've seen from a student pilot, she said quietly. Morrison is either completely incompetent as an evaluator, or he's been deliberately sabotaging your training. Either way, his assessment is bullshit. Back in the conference room, Captain Rodriguez delivered her verdict to the review board. Miss Martinez demonstrates exceptional flying skills, sound judgment, and thorough knowledge of aviation procedures. She is not only qualified to continue in this program, she's among the most promising students I've evaluated in my 10 years as an instructor. Morrison's face went white. That's impossible. You must have given her an easier evaluation. Captain Morrison. Colonel Mitchell interrupted sharply. Are you questioning the professional competence of a senior instructor? The room fell silent. Morrison had overplayed his hand, and everyone knew it. Colonel Mitchell cleared his throat. Miss Martinez, based on this evaluation, you are hereby reinstated in the Thunderbird Academy program with full standing. Captain Morrison, I believe we need to have a private discussion about evaluation standards and consistency. I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, but I knew the real victory wasn't just about staying in the program. It was about proving that talent and determination could overcome prejudice and sabotage. Morrison avoided eye contact as I passed him in the hallway. His reign of terror was over, and we both knew it. Final approach 6 months later, I graduated from Thunderbird Academy at the top of my class. Captain Rodriguez had taken over as my primary instructor, and under her guidance, I'd flourished in ways I never imagined possible. Morrison had been quietly reassigned to administrative duties after an internal investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward female students. 3 other women who'd been previously dismissed were invited to return and complete their training. But the real twist came 2 weeks after graduation. I was working as a flight instructor at a regional airport in Arizona when I got a call from an unexpected source. The United States Air Force. They'd heard about my story through Captain Rodriguez, who had recommended me for their civilian contractor program. We need experienced pilots for a classified project, the recruiter explained. Advanced aircraft testing and evaluation. Your background in both mechanical systems and flight operations makes you an ideal candidate. The project turned out to be testing next-generation fighter aircraft systems, not flying them, but evaluating their performance and providing feedback to improve pilot training protocols. It was exactly the kind of challenging, high-level aviation work I dreamed about. 6 months into the program, I found myself at Nellis Air Force Base, observing F-22 Raptor training exercises. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman Morrison had claimed wasn't good enough for civilian aviation was now helping improve the training for America's most advanced fighter pilots. The final comic twist came during a visit to Thunderbird Academy as a guest speaker. I was invited to address the current class about careers in military aviation contracting. Standing in the same auditorium where Morrison had once dismissed my dreams, I looked out at a class that was nearly 40% women. A dramatic change from the male-dominated program I'd endured. The most important thing I can tell you, I said to those eager faces, is that talent and determination will always triumph over prejudice and sabotage. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong in the sky. After my presentation, a young woman approached me. Maria Santos, now a senior student and class president. "That was incredible," she said with a grin. "Did you hear Morrison got turned down for a job at Phoenix Flight Academy last month? Apparently, they'd heard about his evaluation techniques from some former Thunderbird students." I smiled, thinking about my grandfather's words about karma and patience. Sometimes the best revenge really is just proving them wrong. As I walked across the campus where I'd once felt so isolated and defeated, I thought about all the women who would now have opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. Morrison's legacy would be the changes he'd inadvertently inspired, not the dreams he'd tried to crush. That night, flying home in a small charter aircraft under a canopy of desert stars, I felt a profound sense of closure. I'd not only achieved my aviation dreams, I'd helped ensure that future generations of pilots would face fewer barriers and more opportunities. The sky, as it turned out, really was big enough for all of us. If this story resonated with you, remember that change often starts with someone willing to stand up and fight back. Sometimes the most powerful victories come not from revenge, but from refusing to let others define your limits. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.